Ma Ying-jeou's success in 2012 was a reflection of his ability to put cross-strait relations and the future of cross-strait relations squarely at the center of all electoral discussions. Tsai made the case, which is borne out in polling, that domestic issues were the great priority and that she was better positioned to deal with those problems on behalf of the Taiwan public. So that's parts 1 and 2. I'll shift to part 3 and ask, how much has changed as a result of this election? How fundamental a change have we seen? Now, obviously, control of the office of the president has changed, control of the executive yuan has changed, control of the legislative yuan has all changed. But this stuff happens in elections. But one can go further than that and hypothesize that the 2016 Taiwan election is what students of American elections would call a critical election or a realignment election. Now, what this refers to is an election outcome that reflects not just short-term dissatisfaction with the incumbent leader and his or her party, or in the direction of the country, but a more fundamental and enduring shift in attitudes about policy, about the major challenges facing the society, and which party is best equipped to lead the country in the years and even the decades ahead. These shifts in attitude often reflect, in turn, basic changes in social and economic structure. I think there's a general agreement that the 1932 election was one of these critical elections. It may have been foreshadowed in 1928, but what that election did was end many decades of Republican control of the government for most of the time, and led to decades of Democratic dominance. Didn't mean that a Democrat would always be in the White House. It didn't mean that the Democratic Party would always be in control of both houses of Congress, but that was the norm to which the system returned. I think there's agreement that 1968 was also a critical election. That's when whites in the South deserted the Democratic Party and fled to the Republicans because the Democrats were sort of appealing to black voters in the South. And that has led to several decades of dominance by the Republican Party, broken occasionally by Bill Clinton, who happens to have been from the South. Jimmy Carter was from the South. Barack Obama, a different kind of candidate. So, as far as the answer to my question about Taiwan is concerned, I can't answer the question right now because I don't have the data. Nobody has the data. Very talented scholars in Taiwan are in the process of analyzing the data that was collected around the election, and we will hear from them fairly soon. But I think that we really need to look at this over a period of years, maybe at least one election, to see how significant this really is. Now, there are some things that we do know that may incline us to conclude that this was a critical election. Number one is the percentage of people in Taiwan who say they're Taiwanese or a combination of Chinese and Taiwanese. It's over 80%, and it's been there for a long time. Less than 10% say they're Chinese only. We also know that over 80% of those polled want to maintain the status quo for at least a long period of time. Now, I don't like these polls, and the way they're asked. We can discuss that in the Q&A if you like. It also appears that up until fairly recently, a modest majority preferred the Ma administration's policies of engagement with China over, at least economically, over the DPPs. And there was a very interesting poll in early 2014 that seemed to confirm this. I can give you the details later. What was surprising was that this poll that affirmed Ma's policy was done by the DPP, and they were honest enough to report publicly what the results were, and it came out right before the Sunflower Movement, which had a very different narrative. Now, but we don't know if this was a critical election. Now, this is a very important question, I think, because of how China reads and interprets these results. And so I'm pivoting now to my fourth topic, and that is Beijing's reaction. What I infer about China's assumptions behind its Taiwan policy are 4 points. The first assumption was that Taiwan's social structure was supportive of gradually improving cross-strait relations, leading to eventual unification. Second assumption, the KMT was and would remain Taiwan's dominant party, not every single presidential cycle, but most of the time, and that Beijing could depend on the KMT to pursue mainland-friendly policies. I think this was true of policies from 2008 to 2012, less true of 2012 to 2016, but we can talk about that. Finally, it's actually three assumptions. The third assumption is that the basic balance of sentiment over time favored the KMT and therefore China's interest. Now, one might now hypothesize that as Beijing assesses the degree of change in Taiwan politics, correctly or incorrectly, the more change it sees away from the 2008 to 2016 status quo, and the more it has to question its fundamental assumptions, and the more alarmed it will be. Furthermore, the more alarmed Beijing becomes, the less it will pursue a strategy that's basically political and economic in nature, and the more it might adopt a strategy that is political and military in nature, in the direction of greater hostility and coercion. So, if this was a critical election in the sense that I have defined it, and if Beijing comes to that conclusion, then we are in for a much rockier cross-strait relationship than we've had, certainly for the last 8 years. Now, what's going to happen in cross-strait relations under a Tsai administration? In a way, this is tough to predict because before the election, on the one hand, the mainland was very specific about what reassurances it required from Tsai Ing-wen in order to be willing to sustain cross-strait relations in the way it preferred. On the other hand, Tsai was extremely vague about what her policy set would be. The PRC, including Xi Jinping himself, said that Tsai had to affirmatively accept the 1992 consensus and specifically accept the idea that the geographical territories of the mainland and Taiwan belong to one and the same China. And I'll come back to that last point. Tsai said she would maintain the status quo. Implicitly, she'll maintain the status quo as she defines it. She said in June last year that her policy would be based on the existing ROC constitutional framework and the will of the people. She said both sides should treasure, quote, the accumulated outcomes of more than 20 years of negotiations and exchanges. and that would be the basis of her efforts to further peaceful and stable development of cross-strait relations. So what this suggests is that there were mutually contradictory positions before the election between the two sides, but with hints by Tsai that might be a bow in Beijing's direction. I think the key variable here is whether Beijing is willing to trust what they might call Tsai's basic nature, or how it defines that nature. If they feel that she is bound and determined sooner or later to bring out de jure Taiwan independence, it would be less inclined to accept any reassurance she provides. Now, before the election, I speculated on the scenarios that these pre-election positions suggested, and let me just run through them. First scenario was that Xi Jinping was bluffing in this very hardline and explicit set of requirements he made, but that Taiwan could expect that he would back down once the DPP took power. And that seemed to be Tsai Ing-wen's position. The second possibility is that both Xi Jinping and Tsai Ing-wen were bluffing, the one in very explicit language and the other in very vague language, and that they now will initiate or have initiated a process of mutual accommodation that will allow things to go on more or less the same. Third possibility is that accommodation is not possible, but that Beijing will only inflict limited steps to show its displeasure. And what I have in mind here is to suspend the mechanisms by which the Taiwan government and the Beijing government talk to each other. And these are actually semi-official organizations modeled on the American Institute in Taiwan, but they're good enough for cross-strait work. So they're based on certain premises. The fourth